Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Wrestling Doesn't Make Sense. It's the best podcast on the internet where me and John talk about pro wrestling and whether or not it makes sense. A lot of the time it doesn't. Today we're not going to be talking about zombies. Today we're not going to be talking about people being set on fire and then walking through a magical corridor and then suddenly being A-okay again, only to lose 20 minutes later via ink distraction.
Yeah.
That... when you say it out loud, it just sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense.
Ink distraction. That's funny. So last week, I think we were going to do an episode on Backlash, which was just basically going to be about, all the pay-per-views about Backlash, unless something interesting happened at this year's Backlash pay-per-view, in which case we talk about that. And as we already covered, zombies happened at Backlash this year, so we had to talk about that. But before that, I was doing a little bit of research on the old Backlash shows. I realized I hadn't seen the year 2002 episode of Backlash. I don't know if episode's the right word, but it's the one I'm sticking with. And on that show, there was a lot of fun. Edge versus Kurt Angle and Eddie Guerrero versus RVD are wonderful. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but I would highly recommend them. But there was also a match, Austin versus The Undertaker. No, I'm not a fan. Historically, I think I've said this before in the show. I've never been a big fan of either of those men. So at first I was like, this is going to suck. And I tell you what's really funny about that. The first 5 minutes of that match are brilliant. Because it's just Steve Austin goofing off.
Right.
It is really fun to watch. Because he's not in a big serious program or whatever. He's just that was awesome. It soon got to, it was way too long and, with a silly overbooked storyline where Steve Austin was feuding with Ric Flair, apparently. Ric Flair, of course, being the GM of Monday Night Raw at the time. And the NWO, of course, were involved because this was the year 2002. So why wouldn't the NWO be involved? And but they left the NWO involvement very unclear at the end of Backlash. Okay, so as you remember, at WrestleMania that year, Steve Austin fought Scott Hall.
Yep.
The NWO. And then when is Backlash? A month later. A month after WrestleMania. Undertaker versus Steve Austin. And during that match, Scott Hall and X-Pac walk out. I'm not quite sure why. They don't really talk about it on the show. But Scott Hall and X-Pac come out and just kind of watch the match from the entrance ramp. Very, very strange. So that got me to thinking, right? That is as far as I got to before I started researching stuff. So let me tell you where my train of thought was heading at that moment right there. I wondered, what if Stone Cold Steve Austin had not left the WWE in 2002, where would 2002 where would it have gone for Steve Austin? That's what I was thinking. All right, so we're gonna do a classic Marvel Comics What If episode, which should please both of us because we're both big Marvel Comics fans. So we're gonna do a What If episode. How about that? Alternate universe and all that other complicated bullshit.
Before we get started, I've got a confession to make. I misunderstood the brief slightly and based mine on after WrestleMania 19 when Austin retired.
Ah, okay. Well, now here's what I was thinking. Did I say 2002 or did I say 2003? I guess you probably thought I said when Austin left.
Yes, and I think
therefore that could be interpreted in two ways. When he left after being asked to lose to Brock Lesnar on Raw, which is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Then whenever he came back for one last match against The Rock at WrestleMania 2003, which is what you're talking about.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, this is fun. I should be a better director, I suppose.
I should clear out that earwax in my ears, I think. That'll probably help.
I don't know. Well, I'll tell you what, though. Now that we're here, why don't you tell us what you've come up with, and I can tell you what I've come up with after this.
What? So starting after WrestleMania?
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll do your kind of story. Like, where do you think Steve Austin would have went, and then we'll talk through that, and then I'll put out what I was thinking, and then we'll talk through that. Okay.
Okay. Well, pretty much my storyline with him started off with him pretty much not being around for the next few months. So nothing really changed there, except rather than the next night on Raw after he loses to The Rock at WrestleMania 19, rather than Eric Bischoff firing him, Austin gives like a big speech where he's like questioning whether he can still do this anymore, if he's still able to perform at a high level, blah, 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 and then basically goes off to do some sort of soul searching kind of thing. But the same thing that happens in like actually happened in real life happens as well, where Goldberg makes his like WWE debut that night, where he comes out and interrupts the Rock appreciation night and basically spears the Rock, and then essentially challenges him to a match at Backlash. And so it's just like a way for him to sort of be introduced to the WWE universe and made a big deal all at the same time, where he gets to face Rock at Backlash, picks up the win, and then the following night on Raw after Backlash, he would basically call out Steve Austin, because that's when you think of the two main guys of WWF and WCW, certainly at like the peak of the Attitude Era, those were the like two guys who you kind of picture as like the face of their brands. So Goldberg wants to fight Steve Austin. It's like the big reason why he came to WWE in the first place, but Austin is still off on his spiritual journey, trying to find himself, whatever, but nowhere near TV at that point. Rather than facing Austin, he's interrupted by Triple H, who was the then World Heavyweight Champion.
Of course he was.
Yeah, and he was in real life, in the middle of a real 3-month feud with Kevin Nash as well after WrestleMania. So we'll cut that short.
Sorry to interrupt you, my friend, but a 3-month feud with Kevin Nash in 2003, 0 people remember.
Oh yeah, I mean it all led to a Hell in a Cell match, which we can still do, but we'll bump it up a bit. So rather than happening at Bad Blood, the Hell in a Cell will happen the month before at Judgment Day.
Okay.
So you've got Triple H retaining the title, obviously, but in the meantime, Goldberg has kind of to kind of set him up as a future challenger, he's wrestling Randy Orton, who was a member of Evolution. So now that Goldberg's beat Randy Orton, and like he's continuing to pick up win after win on Raw, and look strong in every match, and not really wrestling long matches or
at all.
Yeah, and he's certainly not having any wigs put on his head or anything like that as well.
Are you putting William Regal in the ring with him?
Yeah, maybe that should be fun.
Just get 7 minutes out of him. That's all we need.
So now the path is clear, and it's Goldberg versus Triple H at Bad Blood in June, and Goldberg steamrolls him, basically, becomes world champion, and then next night on Raw, he's, rather than like celebrate his victory, he still wants Steve Austin, and he's like still calling Austin out, but Stone Cold's still not showing up. So Triple H, he's still in the title hunt. He wants his gold back. They set up a rematch for SummerSlam. There's like an option here maybe to throw in Randy Orton as well, make it a triple threat match rather than a handicap match, even though it's like a handicap match in for all intents and purposes.
In theory, it's a handicap match, but really, because those two guys are greedy sons of bitches, it's
Yeah, I mean, you can always tease that Orton might have like opportunities to win the title, and he's kind of looking to do so, but nothing really comes of it. But it's just like laying seeds down for stuff further down the line, I guess. But after the match, Goldberg picks up the win again. And that's when, the glass hits and out comes Stone Cold for the big face-off between the two. And just when it looks like they're going to go at it, that's when Evolution attack them both and kind of leave them laying at the end of the night. So that would be Triple H, Randy Orton, and Ric Flair, because Batista was still out injured at this point until October of that same year. But so the next night on Raw, Austin's back and he's sort of showing the same old Austin that he was before. He's all confident and whatnot, calling out Goldberg. They agree to a match later in the show, but it never happens because Evolution tried to attack them again, and then Austin and Goldberg have to sort of team up to send them packing. But then that sets up a match at Unforgiven, the next pay-per-view, where it's Austin and Goldberg as uneasy allies against Triple H, Ric Flair, and Randy Orton in a handicap match. You kind of tease the dissension in the ranks between Goldberg and Austin and like whether they can coexist. But at the end of the day, they still managed to pull out the win. Only for Austin to then stun Goldberg after the match and sort of lay his claim for a world title match.
That punk.
Yeah, man. You just can't trust the guy.
Can't trust him. I don't trust him at all. What am I saying that?
Speaking of people we can't trust, we've got Eric Bischoff, who's still the GM of Raw, and he refuses to let the match go ahead, claiming that Steve Austin hasn't done enough to earn a title shot. So he sets up a number one contenders match, say, Austin versus Chris Jericho, where Austin sort of dominates and looks like he's on his way to victory, but then he loses by DQ. Say Mark Henry interferes in the match.
Gotta be somebody.
Yeah, I mean, why not Mark Henry? But this is all to kind of act as a bit of a stopgap, because there was like a 2-month gap between whatever that pay-per-view was, Unforgiven and Survivor Series, which was the next sort of joint pay-per-view with both Raw and SmackDown. So so we do a little sort of side story with Austin trying to get revenge on Mark Henry. Goldberg and Jericho do a little mini feud as well, where Goldberg beats Jericho on Raw and retains the title.
Oh, Jericho's gonna love that one.
Yeah. But again, it like sort of clears the path for Survivor Series and the big Austin and Goldberg match. But at the same time, we also play into the fact that Eric Bischoff, obviously WCW connections with Goldberg, kind of teased the idea that maybe they're working together, although Goldberg seemingly wants nothing to do with Eric Bischoff at all. But you kind of get hints that maybe Bischoff is sort of favoring him, at least, like banning Austin from the arena, or putting Stone Cold in a handicap match against La Resistance or something like that. Okay. But eventually the match gets set for Survivor Series, the big dream match, which I booked kind of like Goldberg and Brock Lesnar, really, just nothing too fancy, but like all the signature moves, just like bish bash bosh, taking each other out. And then but shockingly, it's Goldberg who picks up the win and beats the WWF guy, which I'm sure not many people would expect, especially considering Austin has carried the WWF a good 5+ years by this point. So so Austin is kind of broken again after the loss, questioning if he's still the bionic redneck and the Texas rattlesnake and then every other nickname you want to give him. And then, Goldberg's moved on to his next feud with Kane, where they have a match at Armageddon, and it's Kane who basically has no interest whatsoever in beating Goldberg for the title, but he just like gets himself intentionally disqualified so he can pretty much destroy Goldberg and try setting him on fire. But then that's when Steve Austin shows up to save the day. And like the next night on Raw, he makes it clear that he wants to well, he makes it clear that he respects Goldberg for beating him and everything, but he still wants another shot, and he's gonna, start at the bottom and earn his way to another title opportunity, and he's gonna do it by winning the Royal Rumble. So then he'd just basically take Goldberg's place in the real life feud with Brock Lesnar, where you'd have, I mean, ideally you would have set something up before this, like maybe a little backstage segment with Austin and Lesnar at Survivor Series. But then, yeah, like Austin comes in at number 30 in the Royal Rumble, looks strong, but then Brock Lesnar kind of interferes in the match, and the distraction allows someone to dump Austin. Could say Kurt Angle like it was for Goldberg, like in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then like that follows the same sort of path that we had in real life as well, with Austin returning the favor and costing Brock Lesnar the WWE title against Eddie Guerrero at No Way Out. And then they have their match at WrestleMania. And the way I kind of figure this is Brock Lesnar over on SmackDown, he was going to leave at this point anyway. He was kind of fed up with the travel and the politics and all that kind of shit. So he's gone no matter what. Whereas Goldberg, hopefully, if he's been booked a bit stronger, he might be more inclined to stick around for another year. So fingers crossed he wouldn't be leaving after this WrestleMania. But yeah, so we'd have Austin beat Brock Lesnar, but then like 8 days after that WrestleMania, we've got the WWE draft, and then I'd move him over to SmackDown, where he's got a whole ton of fresh stories and feuds which you can sort of put him into. And I started him off with JBL, because JBL had just become John Bradshaw Layfield at that point. Mm-hmm. But he kind of jumps really quickly into the title feud with Eddie Guerrero with no sort of backstory. Yeah. So I'd use Austin to sort of heat with JBL up as a heel more and get him, better prepared for when he beats Eddie Guerrero for the title. But then you've got, programs with John Cena, potentially Big Show, Eddie Guerrero himself, in fact. And, I even thought of the idea maybe you could put Austin in a tag team with The Undertaker at some point and have them as a couple of Texas outlaws or whatever, just running roughshod over everyone. But I mean, there's options there.
Yeah, I like the Texas kind of rednecks angle. I like that tag team. The couple of questions though, and I do like the story, but Steve Austin, of course, basically the impetus for this was Austin not wanting to lose to Brock Lesnar and taking his ball and going home. Do you think Steve Austin would be that interested in losing to Goldberg?
I think with the possibility of a rematch down the road, he'd be okay with it. Like if it was just a one-off, he'd probably be pretty pissed off and apt to take his ball and go home again. But I hadn't got as far as booking, Austin versus Goldberg 2, but I kind of thought that maybe Stone Cold would have turned heel at some point and then jumped back over to Raw again, so he could, try and get his revenge on Goldberg at some point.
Interesting that you're keeping Steve Austin around, because I figured after 2003, he probably wasn't going to be wrestling too much longer. Regardless of how 2002 played out, he probably wouldn't have been wrestling that much longer anyway. So it's interesting that you would put him in a big feud with Goldberg. Also interesting you would put him in with Goldberg, because Steve Austin has a history of neck issues, and you might want to talk to Bret Hart about Goldberg and his ability to keep people safe in the ring.
Yeah,
on the flip side, Austin could say the same thing about Owen Hart.
Yeah. And this is kind of why I said the match that they'd have would be a pretty short sort of snappy kind of affair. So it's not like they'd be
not gonna be a 5-star classic.
No.
No offense to anybody, but nobody here is really thinking Steve Austin versus Goldberg in 2003, that's going to be wall-to-wall greatness.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So I find that like a lot of emphasis on Goldberg, which I didn't expect. Although
Nor did I when I started it.
I do see your point. Like I feel like eventually, surely Goldberg versus Austin would have been one of those matches.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I dig that. I feel like had Austin stayed into either 2002 or 2003, by 2003 he would be doing something with Goldberg, probably something a lot better than refereeing that shitty match at WrestleMania. You know, but I think it's fair to say that there's money there to be made with Austin and Goldberg. Like even Austin would get that. He'd know, like you said, a loss is a loss, but if he can get it back at a big pay-per-view later on down the road, then that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. Now, again, like because there were a couple of cross wires, my story is more to do with 2002. So we're a couple of months out, but still, I want to throw some stuff out because I think the most important thing between both of these storylines is like how much sense they make, fittingly enough because of the show. But also, I mean, like, we're looking at this like logically, like, what if this really did happen, right? Yeah. What if the butterfly flapped its wings at a certain point and that caused this to happen? It's within the realms of possibility. And you talked about all the shit that could happen, like Triple H being the champion. Of course, it's 100%. So I was thinking about how Steve Austin left. He was supposed to be booked in a match on an episode of Raw on what I wrote all these notes down, but then I wrote them in like such a half-assed fucking haphazard manner that it's impossible to know what the fuck I was doing. June the 10th, episode of Raw, Steve Austin was asked to lose a King of the Ring qualifying match against Brock Lesnar, and he didn't want to do that, understandably so. At the time, I didn't think it was a good move. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I understand where he was coming from, and I believe he was probably correct. Like you said, Steve Austin carried that company on his back for like 5 years, right? There's still money to be made. There's still main events to be had. There's still stories to be told, especially with those WCW guys coming back. And that's where I think things were heading. All right. I think that they were heading to a storyline at SummerSlam. And that's what I wanted to talk about. Now, you are an encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to wrestling. So even though you haven't, like, quote unquote, researched this exact time period we're talking about, I still guarantee you're going to be able to mentally cross-check all these facts and see how it all makes sense, right? You're going to be able to help me out here. But let me lay this to you, okay? WrestleMania 2002, Scott Hall loses to Steve Austin, all right? We talked about Backlash 2002. Scott Hall and X-Pac are watching Stone Cold Steve Austin's match for some reason. Now, at the time, Ric Flair, who was a co-owner of the WWF, about to be the WWE, is having a feud with Steve Austin. But it's also been established that Ric Flair and the NWO not in cahoots. Vince McMahon brought the NWO in to just destroy it because he couldn't be asked working with Ric Flair. That was what the storyline was, right? That is 100% what the storyline was. Vince McMahon built up his own company. Ric Flair came in, and Vince McMahon said, "Fuck you. I'm just going to destroy my own company." And funny enough, in a roundabout way, he kind of has. I feel like he has subtly, brick by brick, destroyed that company. Anyway, I'm getting off topic here. So, it turns out at some point that Ric Flair joined the NWO. That was on May the 6th, which was after Backlash. Backlash was in April. So the week after that, or a week or two after that, May the 6th, Ric Flair joins the NWO.
Yeah.
So this all starts to make sense, right? The NWO thing with Austin has been going on for a little bit, and now this Ric Flair thing with Austin has been going on for a little bit. So we can start to put some numbers together. Okay. It's going to be NWO against Steve Austin. Who is the most likely member of the NWO to fight Steve Austin? And when's the next best opportunity for that to happen? Well, if we're in, May or going into June, because Austin left June 10th, right? So obviously he wasn't being planned to be part of the King of the Ring. They needed him for something else, to set something else up. I feel like they were pointing towards a big marquee match at SummerSlam. Okay.
Yeah.
But like I said, who in the NWO would be a big marquee guy to have a match with Steve Austin at SummerSlam against? Because if they're trying to work Steve Austin versus Ric Flair at SummerSlam, I think I speak for everybody who says, even in 2002, I want to watch that match. So what happened was Steve Austin left June the 10th, which was the same night that Ric Flair decided to abandon being an authority figure. He was no longer just going to be the GM, and he went back to an active wrestling role.
Right.
This is very interesting. Steve Austin leaves, and now I guess Ric Flair has nobody to be a foil against, so he just decides to go back to wrestling. It's very interesting, but he's still technically part of the NWO or aligned with the NWO, right?
Yeah.
A week before that, June the 3rd, Shawn Michaels returns.
Oh.
Now, Shawn Michaels and Steve Austin, they have had a little bit of history, but not enough history as either man would have wanted from a money-making perspective, because in 1998, whenever Steve Austin was becoming the biggest thing, Shawn Michaels had to retire slightly after their big match at WrestleMania in 1998. He had to retire because of back injury issues. And so Austin's run at the top was free to happen without Shawn Michaels' interference. Now, come back to 2002, nobody thought that Shawn Michaels was going to come back. And nobody thought that Steve Austin would ever leave that company. And both of those things happened within a week. Something. Do you get where I'm coming from? The timing seems a little bit off. I feel like they were angling this NWO thing because they were gonna have here's the left field, right? This is a Charlie from Always Sunny chalkboard fucking thing from the mailroom. I don't think they were angling for Shawn Michaels versus Steve Austin at SummerSlam. I don't think that. I feel like now before I had seen the numbers, like Shawn Michaels turning up a week before Steve Austin leaves, I was convinced that Shawn Michaels came back because Steve Austin left. Because I knew they were around about the same time frame. They've lost somebody really big on their roster. They need somebody really big to fill in some kind of role. And they bring Shawn Michaels back and they put him in the NWO. Presumably just to continue whatever storyline they're thinking. At first, I really thought that they lost Austin and then they brought in Shawn Michaels. Now, of course, when I look at the history, it turns out Shawn Michaels came back the week before Austin left. But something still does not up right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think what they were angling for at SummerSlam 2002 is Steve Austin versus Hulk Hogan. I think if that company had any fucking brains in their head, they would have turned Hogan into a heel again.
Yeah.
Like if they had any fucking smarts, they see the NWO comes in February. They see the huge reaction that Hulk Hogan gets for WrestleMania at March. They turn him into a babyface. The NWO continues to exist, but they don't like that Hogan's a babyface. The easiest, the smartest, the most kayfabe thing to do right there is for Hogan to do a double turn and to make everybody think he's a nice, sweet babyface, and then to turn again back to a heel and really, really get people angry at him the way that heels do. I feel like that's what they were setting up. They were setting up Hogan away from the NWO and setting up an Austin NWO feud, only for Hogan to turn on everybody, rejoin the NWO, and set up Austin versus Hogan at SummerSlam. That's what I think and thought and still believe.
Okay.
Does any of that make any sense? Were you able to follow that?
No, I followed it, and I think it's definitely, like you say, Austin Hogan is a match which never really happened on a major stage. Certainly not after Austin became the star that he did, and it always felt like one of those missed opportunities.
Right.
So
But
the fact that they hadn't done that, and the fact that if you did Austin versus Hulk Hogan, ideally, you need one of them to be the heel, and Hogan turning heel again and rejoining the NWO would have, played that role perfectly.
it would have been so obvious because The Rock was a great babyface, but when he's in there with Hulk Hogan, everybody just wanted to see the red and yellow again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that made sense for that to happen mid-match. You give him a month or two of the red and yellow, right? And then you switch it back, people are going to love it. Because you've got, after Hulk Hogan is done with this NWO run, which of course we all know, realistic in real life, the NWO from 2002 weren't going to last until 2010, right?
Yeah.
They had a finite amount of time on the clock. Smart money would be take advantage of that time, use that calendar year, and then turn Hogan back into a babyface. Because by that point, he'll be like I was going to say like he is now. That's not correct. But I mean like one of those like legends. Oh, he comes back and he makes an appearance and everybody loves him, right?
Mm.
But you milk him being a heel as long as you can because you're not going to have that time for him for long. Now, if you put him up there against Steve Austin, people aren't going to be cheering for the red and yellow again. They're going to be cheering Steve Austin. And if that's the case, then it's going to be very easy to pivot Hogan back into being a heel with the NWO. But you have to do it in 2002. It doesn't make any sense to do it any other time. Has to be done like really shortly, a couple of months after WrestleMania, right? And then that way you can set up Hogan. It's so funny that you set up you set up Austin versus Goldberg, and I set up Austin versus Hogan. Two matches that never really happened, and two matches that people would talk about. I mean, in a just society, we could do both. We could do one in 2002, one in 2003.
Yeah.
But it was the Shawn Michaels thing that was throwing me off, because I still kind of think that Shawn Michaels was brought in as a big name in order to replace somebody else, right? The timing is off. Something's up with that. Why then was it that Shawn Michaels came back? I feel like the reason that it was then that Shawn Michaels came back is because they made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and also because they needed him. They needed that guy because they were losing somebody. And I think maybe they thought they were losing The Rock, and they weren't expecting Austin to be the one that they lost. But I feel like they brought Shawn Michaels back on purpose around that time in order to not necessarily add some value to the NWO. But again, like if that happened, you could easily do a Shawn Michaels Hulk Hogan thing at Survivor Series or like down the line, right?
Mm.
You can plant the seeds for that. I don't think they would have done Shawn Michaels versus Steve Austin, but they're clearly angling at the NWO versus Austin continuing well after WrestleMania, and that shit got me thinking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was thinking about.
I think
don't know, man.
The only issue I have with that is, I mean, like the Shawn Michaels Triple H story, which they did end up going with, like heading into SummerSlam that year, was kind of perfect because of their personal history, which everyone knew about, and the history of DX and whatnot. So them kind of coming together, doing the little DX reunion, and then Triple H turning on him and turning heel for the first time in a year. All of that was just such a perfect story that I don't know. I mean, I don't think they would have had any other plans or any plans which could have compared to that when they made the decision to bring Shawn Michaels back. Right. And I think as well, like the big selling point for bringing him back and putting him with the NWO was because the NWO at that point was just shitting the bed massively. Like Scott Hall had already been released from his contract. I think Kevin Nash was still out injured at that point. You had, Big Show and Ric Flair and X-Pac, and it wasn't exactly the there you go. And it wasn't the same NWO that Vince had brought in to sort of poison the company or whatever. It was just like, a bunch of ex-WCW guys at that point, and maybe not that threatening.
But like all of that, like so much that doesn't make any sense, right? Because like Triple H, and while I do agree that the Triple H and Shawn Michaels match and the whole storyline was beautifully done, perfect. But like that could have been done if Shawn Michaels had came back at any time, right? If Shawn Michaels had came back in the middle of 2003, that would have worked. But Shawn Michaels, for some reason, came back in the NWO whenever it should have clearly been Hulk Hogan leading the NWO, because that's the point of the NWO, right? Like it didn't. I always find that weird that Shawn Michaels came back in the NWO because it's Shawn Michaels. If Shawn Michaels comes back, the spectacle itself is enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of Shawn Michaels just being able to wrestle again after 4 years would be a selling point, because surely bringing Shawn Michaels in as part of the NWO would make him a heel. But like we saw with Hulk Hogan, bringing him back itself is a good thing. It's a positive thing. We want to cheer Shawn Michaels. It's great that he's back. So it's very interesting they would put him in the NWO and then do the feud with Triple H, because it would make it seem as if they brought in Shawn Michaels with no intention of doing that Triple H feud. Now, like you said, it was great, and it's on the table because of their history. It feels like that would have happened anyway, right? So why did they do the NWO thing? Now, yes, maybe it's because it was shitty, right? But like I said, the Hulk Hogan thing would have made way more sense. Turning Hulk Hogan back again and putting him back in the NWO makes way more sense than bringing Shawn Michaels out of retirement and then putting him into the NWO, unless that had part of the storyline, right?
Yeah.
Because Kevin Nash was still in it too.
Yeah.
So what if at SummerSlam we had seen Hogan versus Austin and Nash versus Michaels? And then from Nash versus Michaels, it's an easy transition to Michaels versus Triple H.
Well, what if the point of bringing back Shawn Michaels and putting him in the NWO was to sort of tease Triple H joining the NWO as well? Because he was still a babyface at that point, and I think it would have been sort of an interesting storyline to kind of tease him turning heel again and joining up with his clique buddies, Nash and X-Pac and Shawn Michaels and whatnot. And
Big Show.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, they could have turned the NWO into like the clique and maybe done something there and spun that out into something where maybe, Triple H and Shawn Michaels start clashing over who's leading it now, because Shawn Michaels was used to being the leader back in the day when he was still wrestling and still part of DX. But now Triple H obviously is kind of come into his own and he doesn't want to share that spotlight. So maybe you could have had a bit of dissension in the ranks there and kind of kicked off a storyline based on that.
But you see, and I do agree with you in that's like, that would make the most sense, wouldn't it? Right? Yeah. Like if you're having Shawn Michaels in the NWO, a man who has almost nothing to do with the NWO, right? Now you can say he's friends with some of the guys in it, but as we all know, that doesn't mean anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hogan wasn't friends with Nash and Hall, and he was one of the main members of the NWO.
Yeah.
Right. So like being friendly with a guy. Again, what they should have done is done like a DX versus NWO thing.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair, because instead of making it seem like Triple H is going to join the NWO, I think it would have made way more sense to have Triple H persuade Shawn Michaels to come and form DX again with him against Nash and Hall with X-Pac in the middle.
Yeah.
There is a storyline, right? And then once that resolves itself, bam, instantly, the worst amount of heat on Triple H whenever he screws over Shawn Michaels right after that.
Mm-hmm.
After he spent all that time getting Shawn Michaels to come to his side, only for Triple H to screw him over again. Perfect, right? See, this is what I love, like discussing this shit, because we're like, wow, this is way better than whatever garbage we got in real life. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
There's ways to work with these groups and shit, and they didn't do any of it, which makes me wonder what it was they were trying to do. You know what I mean? Like that. Yeah, I don't know, man. I feel like surely there was more to that NWO thing than they played it as. I feel like once Hogan left the group, they just gave up on it.
Yeah.
When that should have been the bait and switch. In my opinion, in my own head, I'm like, that should have been the most obvious bait and switch ever. Like, but they didn't. They just gave up on it, right? Which again makes you wonder why they would put Shawn Michaels in it. Because you don't give up on something that you put Shawn Michaels into. You just brought him back. You've just had him return. You know what I mean? Something isn't adding up. That's all I'm saying. Something doesn't quite add up. Because at first I was thinking, if Austin hadn't left, would Shawn Michaels have come back at all? Now, like I said, I got my time slightly mixed up. Although that was a very interesting kind of what if. You know. But still, it means for like a week, the WWE roster was stacked full of like crazy ass main eventers. And in some ways, it's like, well, how do you please all of these main eventers?
Yeah.
How do you please Shawn Michaels and Triple H and Nash and Hall and Hulk Hogan and The Rock and
Undertaker, Kurt Angle,
of course, Kurt Angle, and then you got the other guys, you know, like Jericho and Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, all these guys like getting up there, and then you got the other guys who are going to be coming in from WCW, like you're gonna have Goldberg coming in too, and Scott Steiner in 2003, all this stuff.
Yeah.
How do you like that? Must have been very. That's also why I think that if you look at that stretch between like WrestleMania and SummerSlam, on 2002, the title changes hands a lot, and it changes hands to, you know, the big guns. Basically, you know, Triple H wins it at Mania, and then I think he loses it to Hogan.
Yeah.
And Hogan loses it to the Undertaker.
Yeah.
And then the Undertaker loses it to The Rock.
Yeah.
I think. So then you're like, well, you look at those guys, like they're the big main eventers, and to me it seemed a little bit like some of those guys, like especially for Hogan and The Rock, you're like, this could be it, that could be it, right? Logically, Hogan, you're like, come on, man, you're not gonna be wrestling for another 5 years, ha 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 ha. We all know how that worked. And then, funny enough, you know, 5 years after that, The Rock wouldn't be wrestling full time at all. So you're like, that felt like a little kind of like greatest hits package, right? Which was very sweet. But it also felt like, and like, again, when you look at it, like Hogan was champion for a month. Who gives a fuck about that, right? Who wants to be champion for a month? The Rock, and again, The Rock, like, he takes on the chin, man. Has he ever had a substantial fucking title reign? I don't think so.
Nope.
But it doesn't matter because he's The Rock, right? So he's happy to let that shit slide. But like, wouldn't it have made more sense if they sat and built up Hogan like a credible threat and then used the last year that they had with him to do something? You know?
Well, I think as well, we got to take into account that obviously they had decided to bring Brock Lesnar up at this time and strap the rocket to him. And the plan was to kind of have Brock Lesnar win the undisputed title at SummerSlam. So using The Rock to put him over, I guess, was seen as a good way to kind of put the stamp of approval on Brock Lesnar, especially with Austin having sort of taken his ball and gone home at that point. Maybe Austin could have filled that role, but then
Right. But
that's another reason why Austin didn't want to lose to him in the King of the Ring.
Exactly. Why would that company look at Steve Austin and The Rock and think The Rock is the one we need to protect right now, and Austin is the one that can take a loss on TV with no consequence? Now, can I just say, a lot of other wrestlers have beaten people like The Rock and Triple H in order to further storylines. So I think part of the issue Austin had here was that it wasn't, part of a storyline, and it wasn't like a dusty finish or anything like that. It was just he was going to lose clean on some regular episode of Raw, whenever you could have built up to that, the way they were building up to Rock versus Brock.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's interesting as to why they thought The Rock was the guy for that job and not Steve Austin, right?
Yeah,
because they must have known that like ahead of time. They must have known all this stuff. This is what I'm saying, dude. There are questions. I feel like they knew something was going to happen with Austin. That's how I feel. Conspiracy theory head. I feel like they knew. Shawn Michaels came back a week before that. They must have known something was up with Austin, and I bet that they knew if they'd asked Austin to do that, he wouldn't have done it. And they did it anyway.
Yeah.
See what I mean? I feel like, I don't know why, but I feel like at that point they were willing to let Steve Austin go.
Yeah.
Because if he wanted to walk away, where is he going to go in 2002?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and he was probably in a sorry mood. And as we all know, he retired in 2003 because of health reasons. His neck was still and continues to, I believe, like cause him issues, and he was having other like health problems and stuff. So realistically, he wouldn't have been resting that much longer anyway. But him walking out means that he voided his contract, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Which would mean they wouldn't have to pay whatever giant contract they had him sign, right?
Mm-hmm.
Much the same way they did to Bret Hart, 1997. Right?
Yeah.
Shawn Michaels is smack dab in the middle of everything. Right? That bit, of course, is no more. But I'm just saying. I'm just saying, dude. Right? The pieces fit. Things can be put into place. And when I say the pieces fit, I mean it's a very tenuous link at best. But you know what I mean? Like something just doesn't add up. There's a lot of things in place here that it seemed like they were gunning for, and nothing seemed to work. This, I don't know, man. This whole the timing of Steve Austin leaving and Shawn Michaels coming back, something's up.
Maybe. I mean, I think it's probably more likely that it was just part of the sort of car crash nature of wrestling, that you have all these unexpected things happen, like people going down injured or getting fired or quitting or whatever, or in Austin's case, getting more and more pissed off with the creative he's given and like kicking up more and more of a fuss. Maybe they did see the writing on the wall there a bit, and were kind of bringing back the likes of Shawn Michaels to help out, or just like lay the foundations in case Steve Austin did walk, and they needed someone else to step in and kind of play a big part in storylines or whatever. But I don't know. It's hard to say because, well, for one, like this is almost 20 years ago now, and I'm sure not many people's memories are that fresh when it comes to all the ins and outs of what was going on. But it's just it's hard to put your finger on. I can see why you think maybe something was going on, but I don't know. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on this one, I think.
Now here's the thing. I reluctantly I'm going to have to agree with you. I feel like as much as I have made my case, and as much as I have said my piece and allowed people to make their own minds, and the pieces are there, and it's all you can trace most of it. It all kind of makes sense. My theory kind of makes sense. However, I do agree with you completely in that that's just the nature of that company. 20 years from now, if we look back on some of the stuff we've been talking about in the last couple of shows, you could probably go, there's probably a link here between this and that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Totally forgetting that at the time, much as it is right now, they were just making it all up. Like, they don't know what the fuck they're doing. We've seen issues where Raw isn't finished until the day of the show, an hour before the show, which is bad news. Not a very good way to run your wrestling company. So I imagine it was much the same in 2002. And like you said, they had so many different egos to stroke. So many fucking different people they had to keep happy. It couldn't have been easy for those guys. So I admit that they probably had a lot to worry about, But I just thought it'd be fun to throw a little hypothetical. You know? And also what I liked about that was it allowed us to talk about Goldberg a little bit. And no, I know. But I wanted to include your story as well, because Goldberg is definitely a guy who they also bungled the first time around. I don't know what they thought they were going to happen, but his run the first time around was terrible.
Yep.
Right. So, and they didn't give us had like people freaked out more about Austin versus Rock than they did about the idea of Austin versus Goldberg, because they could have done Austin Goldberg at that Mania and they didn't. Well, could they have?
Well, Goldberg's signing was announced on that WrestleMania, and then he debuted the next night on Raw.
Right. Okay, this is a tricky bit. We don't know where contracts run up, etc. But I feel like they could have set that up and they didn't.
Well, I think as well, because Austin sort of knew that was going to be his last match going into it, he wanted to have it with someone like The Rock, who obviously he had wrestled hundreds of times before, probably in all the house shows and stuff that they'd been on as well, and knew the kind of match they could tell and have that trust with someone as well. So he probably thought this is the best way to go out, and it tells a good story as well, like the third in their WrestleMania trilogy, where Austin has kind of won the previous two battles, and now he's doing the honors for The Rock. So
he didn't really win the second one. He cheated.
Well, he still walked out with the title.
Well, only because Vince McMahon, yada yada. Yeah, but like they dropped the ball with Goldberg, and in 2003, I feel like I don't know what I feel like. I feel like it could have happened if both Goldberg and Austin were willing to listen to business. But again, I feel like by 2003, Austin had finished listening to business.
Yeah. It's a shame as well, man. He was only 38 years old when he hung up his boots for the last time. And you look at a lot of the top names of today who still wrestling into their 40s and even their 50s. Yeah. So
what age is Jericho?
Jericho, I believe he is 50 years old.
Fun sidebar. Sometimes when you watch All Elite Wrestling, Jericho looks really sick. But sometimes you watch that show and he looks great.
Yeah.
What the fuck? Why doesn't he look great every week?
Well, because he is 50 years old, and it's hard to do that every week.
Fair enough. All right. Is there anything else you want to say about this strange topic that we decided to talk about today?
No, not that I can think of, really.
Would you be interested in doing this kind of thing again?
Yeah.
Talking about a hypothetical?
Absolutely. Because the thing I liked about this discussion is it kind of started off as talking about Austin, but we branched off to talk about the NWO and Goldberg and all sorts of different things as well. So
yeah, I think there's a lot to discuss for this. You know, and again, I'm probably way off the mark, but I also feel like I'm really close. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, something doesn't work, but I've almost cracked his case. So yeah, I think that's something we could definitely talk about, because wrestling's full of crazy bullshit like this. So like, we could totally do another hypothetical, and there are loads to do, right? There is so many. I've already thought of one right now. I don't know if he will do this. I might cut this bit out. But like, what if the brawl for all like never happened?
Yeah.
Because nothing good came from the brawl for all itself, but the brawl for all was supposed to be set up in order to set up Dr. Death, Steve Williams.
That's right. Yeah.
So what if they just didn't do that and they set him up normally? Like, would they have done something with Dr. Death versus Dan Severn?
I think the idea was to build up Dr. Death as like potential opponent for Steve Austin.
Until Steve Austin takes his ball and goes home.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense. But I'm like, when you look at the roster back then, Kent Shamrock as well, Steve Blackman, there are stories to be told with these legit fighters versus Dr. Death that could have been told. Even when they brought Steven Regal in there eventually, like, wouldn't that have been lots of fun to go down and see? You know, I feel like that's a hypothetical you could maybe go down. Where, but again, here's a fun story to all the folks at home listening to the show. If you liked it, let us know. Give it a like and a subscribe, etc. But if you want to hear us do more like hypotheticals and what's ifs and stuff, such as the Brawl for All or anything, you know, other stuff like that, let us know in the comments. Like, keep us posted. You know, we'd love to hear, to see what people are interested in, because I think this is something we'll probably go back to at some point. But we'd like to see what you guys want to hear about us do as well. That would be really interesting. But that's it. Anything else you want to say? Or are we good?
I think we're good.
Hooray! Well, that's another episode of the podcast in the bank. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to stick around for next week. We'll have another podcast about pro wrestling and whether or not it makes sense. I don't know what it's going to be about, so you're going to have to just tune in and check out to find out. But that's it. So thank you very much for listening, guys. And we will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.